At 62, Michael Jordan, the man the world once viewed as unstoppable, unbreakable, and almost superhuman, now faces a reality few ever imagined for him. For decades, he was the face of greatness, the definition of ambition, the living proof that impossible dreams could be conquered. Yet today, behind the success, the fortune, and the legacy that shaped global sports culture, there is a sadness surrounding him that fans can feel but struggle to fully understand. Those who followed his journey from the very beginning remember him as the athlete who refused to lose, the competitor who transformed every failure into motivation, and the icon who set standards others still chase. But the man behind the legend is now dealing with a series of emotional battles that have slowly reshaped his life. Friends say he spends more time alone, more time reflecting, and far less time seeking the spotlight he once dominated with ease. Some point to the strain of old rivalries, others to the personal losses that cut deeper than any defeat on the court. And many believe the weight of being a global symbol for so long has finally taken its toll. Even his most loyal supporters admit they've never seen him this withdrawn. Photos from recent months show a man who appears quieter, more distant, as if carrying a burden far heavier than anything he faced during his career. And as new details emerge about the struggles he keeps private, fans can't help but ask, how did the strongest figure in modern sports reach a place this painful? The truth behind Michael Jordan's heartbreak at 62 is not just emotional, it's devastating. Let's uncover what really happened. For most of his life, Michael Jordan was defined by one thing: complete control. On the court, he controlled the pace, the outcome, and even the emotions of entire arenas. Off the court, he controlled his brand, his privacy, and the image the world saw. But at 62, that sense of control has slowly slipped away, leaving him in a place that feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and deeply isolating. Those who have followed his journey for decades say Michael never feared pressure or failure, he feared losing the ability to shape his own story. Today, that fear has become his reality. One of the biggest turning points in Michael's life came after stepping away from the game permanently. Many believed his retirement would bring peace, rest, and the chance to enjoy the success he earned. Instead, it opened a door to something he had avoided for years: the quiet. For a man who lived inside constant competition, silence became unsettling. Friends say the rush of the game was not just excitement for him, it was identity. Without it, Michael struggled to fill the emotional space basketball once occupied. His attempt to transition into ownership seemed, at first, to provide a new purpose. But behind the scenes, the pressures of running a team were nothing like leading one on the court. The losses felt heavier, the criticism stung deeper, and the responsibility was far more complex. When he eventually stepped away from ownership, many close to him described it as another identity he had to let go. For someone who built an entire legacy around winning, stepping down carried a weight he rarely shows publicly but deeply feels. Adding to the emotional strain is the growing physical toll that age and years of intense play have taken on his body. The jumps, the landings, the repeated impacts, each one contributed to lasting discomfort he now manages daily. For an athlete who once moved effortlessly, the realization that time has finally caught up has been difficult to process. He doesn't talk about it much, but those around him notice the slower steps, the careful movements, and the acknowledgement that he can no longer perform even simple activities without planning ahead. But perhaps the hardest part for Michael has been the emotional distance that has gradually emerged in his personal life. People who once saw him smiling, joking, and enjoying the company of close friends say he now spends long periods alone, often retreating into private spaces away from the public eye. He has always been protective of his personal world, but the shift in recent years has been more pronounced, more noticeable, and more concerning. Some say the pressures of fame finally caught up to him. Others believe the weight of past rivalries, losses, and unspoken grief has grown heavier with age. It's clear that the spotlight he once commanded with pride now feels harsher, more intrusive. Michael never wanted to be seen as vulnerable, but this chapter of his life has forced him to confront emotions he spent decades avoiding. More than anything, those close to him say he is battling the quiet realization that even legends must face moments that can't be fixed with determination alone. For the first time, Michael Jordan, a symbol of strength and certainty, has reached a point where the challenges are not on the court, but within himself, and that battle, far away from the roar of the crowd, is the one he struggles with the most. As Michael Jordan moved deeper into his 60s, one painful reality became impossible to ignore. The relationships he once relied on were no longer the same. For decades, the world saw him as untouchable, but behind the legend was a man who carried more emotional weight than he ever showed. And now, those long-buried struggles have resurfaced in ways even he never expected. One of the biggest sources of heartbreak has been the growing distance between Michael and the people who once formed the closest circle around him: teammates who celebrated victories with him, friends who traveled the world at his side, and even family members who stood with him through the toughest years. All slowly drifted away over time, not because of conflict, but because Michael spent so many years building walls that eventually became too high for others to climb. Those close to him say he has always struggled with vulnerability. Winning came easily to him, opening up did not. During his career, that emotional toughness made him unstoppable. But as he aged, the same toughness turned into isolation. The more success he achieved, the harder it became to let anyone see his weaknesses. And now, at 62, the consequences of that emotional armor have become painfully clear. Another part of Michael's heartbreak comes from something he rarely talks about: regret. Not regret for the championships, the awards, or even the fierce competitiveness that defined him. Instead, regret for the moments he missed, the connections he didn't nurture, and the people he never allowed close enough to truly understand him. In private conversations, those who have known him for decades describe a man who now reflects more than he ever has, questioning whether the price he paid for greatness was larger than he realized. At the time, this emotional shift has become even more visible in recent years. Fans noticed he appears more withdrawn in public, often serious, often reflective. In photos, he looks like a man carrying memories that weigh far heavier than any trophy he ever lifted. He has spoken openly about how grief from earlier losses in his life still lingers, and how certain moments from his past continue to follow him even now. Adding to that struggle is the loneliness that fame brings, something few understand, but many who have reached his level of success eventually feel. People admire Michael. They study him. They follow his every move, but very few truly know him. And as he ages, that gap between admiration and connection has never felt wider. Those around him say that, despite the global respect he commands, he often feels more alone than people can imagine. His journey into later life has also forced him to confront how quickly time passes. Children grow up, friends move on, the game evolves, and the world forgets the little details that once defined him. For someone who lived in the center of global attention for so many years, watching the spotlight move elsewhere has been an emotional adjustment he never fully prepared for. Yet the most tragic part of Michael's struggle is that the world still sees him as invincible. Many people forget that behind the legend is a man who experienced pressure, loss, and emotional turmoil that most people will never comprehend. Even now, as he faces one of the hardest chapters of his life, the expectation remains that he should remain strong, composed, and unshakable. The world expects Michael Jordan to be Michael Jordan, even when the man himself is carrying a pain that goes far deeper than anyone realizes. And as he continues to navigate this phase of life, the question grows heavier. How does someone who was always the strongest finally learn to accept the moments when he cannot be? As the years passed, another painful challenge emerged for Michael. Jordan, one that cut deeper than any rivalry, criticism, or physical struggle. The transition from being the most recognizable athlete on the planet to a man living outside the competitive world was not smooth, and it revealed a side of Michael that almost no one had seen before: the fear of fading relevance. For most of his life, the world revolved around him. Every game, every interview, every highlight pushed him further into the global spotlight. But now, in a world dominated by new stars, new stories, and new legends, Michael has been forced to confront something he never expected: an uncomfortable sense of being left behind. It's not that people have forgotten him, they never will, but the feeling of no longer being at the center of the world he once ruled has quietly taken an emotional toll. Friends say he still follows this sport closely, but with a mix of pride and sadness. He watches players break records he once held, reach milestones he once set, and receive praise he knows well, and while he celebrates their success, there's a silent ache that comes from knowing he can no longer step onto the court and prove himself again. For a man whose entire identity was built on competition, that realization has been one of the hardest to accept. Another source of heartbreak comes from how much the game itself has changed. The style, the culture, the athletes, everything has evolved. Michael often speaks about how different the sport feels now, and not always in a way he relates to. It's like watching a world he helped build slowly drift in a direction that feels unfamiliar. That sense of emotional distance has made him even more reflective, sometimes even nostalgic for a time when everything felt simpler, clearer, and more under his control. But perhaps the most difficult emotional weight Michael carries is the pressure of his own legacy. While the world praises him as the greatest, he sees the other side of that legacy: the expectations, the constant comparisons, the never-ending conversations about who ranks above whom. He never asked to be the standard the entire sport measures itself against. Yet the responsibility of that label, even decades later, remains heavy. It follows him everywhere, even into his 60s, where he now faces the question of what it means to be remembered, not just for what he did, but for who he was. People close to him say Michael often thinks about the future in ways he never did before. He wonders how history will view him, what chapter of his story will matter most, and whether the world will ever truly understand the sacrifices behind his success. These thoughts linger with him during quiet moments, especially now that he spends more time removed from the public eye. The emotional distance between Michael and the outside world has grown in subtle ways too. His appearances are less frequent, his interviews more controlled, and his desire for privacy stronger than ever. Some believe he is trying to protect the last pieces of himself that were never in the spotlight. Others think he simply no longer has the energy to maintain the image of invincibility he once wore with pride. Still, beneath the quiet, beneath the reflection, and beneath the growing sense of isolation, one truth remains: Michael Jordan is human. The world may see the legend, but the man behind the legacy carries wounds that no championship could heal, and memories that no amount of fame can erase. And as he continues through this chapter of life, those emotional battles have become the most heartbreaking part of his story. As Michael Jordan enters this later stage of life, the weight of everything he has carried emotionally, mentally, and physically has become clearer than ever. What makes his story so heartbreaking isn't just the pressure of aging or the loneliness of fame. It's the realization that even after decades of inspiring the world, the man behind the legend is still trying to understand what life looks like without the one thing that once gave him purpose. One of the most painful aspects of this chapter is how much Michael struggles with the idea of slowing down. He spent years building an identity around excellence, leadership, and relentless obsession. Now, his days are quieter, slower, and filled with long stretches of time that once would have been filled with training, competition, or travel. Instead of schedules packed with practices and games, he faces days where his thoughts are his only opponent, and often they are the toughest battles of all. Friends say he often reflects on the choices he made, the sacrifices he embraced, and the moments he pushed aside while chasing greatness. He built an empire, yet sometimes feels like he missed out on simple human experiences, moments of connection, softness, and vulnerability that he didn't allow himself to feel while he was focused on being the best. Now, at 62, those thoughts visit him more frequently, giving him a sense of longing that even he can't easily explain. Another element of heartbreak is the way Michael sees the world changing around him. People he once leaned on have aged, moved on, or faced their own struggles. Some friendships faded, not out of conflict, but from the natural drift that time creates. Those who knew him in his prime say there was always a sadness inside him, a quiet layer of emotion he kept hidden behind his competitiveness. Now, with fewer distractions, that sadness sits closer to the surface, publicly. Michael still appears strong, composed, and confident, but privately, those around him notice the small signs of emotional exhaustion. He is more reflective, more guarded, and more cautious with how he spends his energy. The pressure of being a global symbol for so long took a toll that no one fully understood, until he allowed himself to step back from the public eye. Even his relationship with his own legacy has changed. The world constantly reminds him of the legend he once was. But Michael now thinks more about what his legacy means beyond statistics and awards. He wonders how his journey will impact future generations, what young athletes will learn from his struggles, and whether people will ever truly understand the emotional cost behind the victories that defined him. Yet despite the heartbreak, there is also a quiet strength in this chapter. Michael's life today is marked not only by loss, but by growth. He has begun to find peace in moments of stillness, learning to appreciate the life he built rather than constantly trying to outrun it. He spends more time with his family, more time surrounded by people who love him not for what he accomplished, but for who he is still. The tragedy remains that the world often forgets to see him as human. They see the champion, the competitor, the man who refused to lose, but few recognize the decades of emotional burdens he carried, the weight of expectations, or the loneliness that came with being the most celebrated athlete on the planet. At 62, Michael Jordan's story is not simply about success or fame. It is about the quiet battles he never spoke about, the pain he never showed, and the emotional journey that continues long after the crowds stopped cheering. And that truth, more than anything he faced on the court, is what makes his story so deeply heartbreaking.